In the year 622, a small community of migrants arrived at the oasis settlement of Yathrib, soon to be renamed Medina, the city. They arrived with almost nothing. No agricultural land of their own, no established trade networks, no inherited wealth. What this community built over the following decade was not merely a religious movement, but an economic system, one built substantially on extraction rather than production. To understand why the Arabian Peninsula erupted into war within months of Muhammad's death in 632, we first have to understand, in concrete material terms, exactly what kind of economy he left behind. Medina itself was a modest agricultural settlement, home to a mixed population of Arab tribes, the Aws and Khazraj, who would become known as the Ansar, the helpers, alongside Jewish tribes, including the Banu Kainuka, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza. Date palm cultivation formed the backbone of the local economy, supplemented by limited grain production and livestock. This was sufficient to sustain the existing population at a modest level. It was not a base capable of generating the surplus wealth a rapidly growing religious and political movement would need to fund itself, arm itself, and eventually project power across an entire peninsula. The migrants who followed Muhammad from Mecca, the Muhajirun, arrived having left behind whatever property and trade relationships they once held. Some had been modestly prosperous merchants. Almost none arrived with capital sufficient to re-establish that prosperity in a city where they had no land, no customer relationships, and no local standing to draw on. Muhammad's response was the institution of formal brotherhood pairings between individual migrants and individual host families, an arrangement that testifies directly to the depth of the problem. An entire displaced community needed to be materially absorbed into a population that had not budgeted for their arrival, because the migrants possessed no independent means of supporting themselves. Whatever spiritual significance later tradition attached to this pairing, its immediate function was economic triage. The revenue question in these early years was urgent and unresolved. Agricultural expansion was slow and land-constrained. Manufacturing was never significant to Medinan life. And peaceful long-distance trade, the very activity that had made Mecca prosperous, was not available to a community that had just broken with the Meccan elite who controlled it. The solution that emerged, and which would come to define Medinan economic life for the next decade, was organized raiding, formalized progressively into a systematic, centrally administered extraction economy built from several interlocking revenue streams. Gazo, the raiding of caravans and rival settlements. Fida, the ransoming of captives taken in these raids, a formal system dividing war spoils with a fixed share directed to the central authority, the conversion of captured people, overwhelmingly women and children, into economic property through slavery and concubinage, and zakat, a tax on wealth that, on close inspection, was frequently a recurring levy on wealth whose original acquisition was itself downstream of this same conquest economy. What distinguishes this history from a simple account of tribal raiding is its trajectory. In the earliest years, raids were modest, opportunistic, and defensive, the posture of a community primarily concerned with its own survival. By the mid-620s, following the victory at Badr and the consolidation of Medinan authority within the city itself, including the expulsion of the Banu Kainuka and Banu Nadir, and later the defeat of the Banu Qurayza, the raiding apparatus had grown far more organized and capable of sustained campaigning at greater distance. By 628, the conquest of the wealthy fortified settlement at Khaybar demonstrated the capacity to seize and administer a substantial productive economic asset. By 630, the largely negotiated conquest of Mecca brought an entire major trading city's commercial infrastructure under Medinan authority, a transformation of an entirely different order than anything achieved a decade before. The period that followed, often called the Year of Delegations, saw tribal confederations from across the peninsula send envoys to Medina to negotiate submission, typically combining religious conversion, political allegiance, and an ongoing fiscal obligation flowing back to the Medinan Treasury. By the time of Muhammad's death in June 632, the flow of spoils, tribute, and zakat into Medina had reached a scale unimaginable to the small, dependent community that had arrived 10 years earlier. This scaling created a specific and severe dependency. Medina's solvency, its capacity to fund an expanding military establishment, administer growing territory, and hold together an increasingly large coalition of tribal allies, rested entirely on the assumption of continued dominance, continued conquest, and continued willingness among subordinated tribes to keep paying. There was no independent economy waiting in reserve if that machine ever stalled. Medina's own agricultural base had not grown to match the scale of the political and military apparatus, now depending on it. This is the story this documentary sets out to trace in full, not a religious narrative with economic footnotes, but an economic engine whose specific mechanics, raiding, ransom, the formal division of spoils, and the conversion of captives into revenue-generating property explain what happened the moment its central authority figure died, why the resulting war took the shape it did, and why it pivoted almost immediately into the conquest of Iraq and Syria rather than settling into a stable, self-contained state. One note on method, stated plainly before we go further. The sources this documentary draws on, the earliest biographical traditions about Muhammad and the hadith collections compiled after them, were assembled generations after the events they describe, shaped by the political and scholarly concerns of the periods in which they took final form. This documentary does not treat them as neutral reportage, nor as unquestionable religious truth. It treats them as historical evidence, read critically, checked wherever possible against outside corroboration, and interpreted for what they reveal about the economic and political structure of the community that produced them. What follows is a critical historical argument, not a theological one, and where the evidence runs out and interpretation begins, this documentary says so directly, rather than presenting inference as settled fact. The practice of ghazu, raiding rival tribes, caravans or settlements, for goods, livestock and status, long predated Islam by centuries. Across pre-Islamic Arabia, raiding functioned as a recognized semi-institutionalized mechanism through which tribes without substantial agricultural surplus or settled wealth acquired resources and asserted dominance over rivals. It was bound by informal codes. Certain months were traditionally sacred and fighting free. Certain targets were considered off-limits, and raids were understood as a recurring, almost economic feature of desert life, rather than extraordinary acts of war. What changed under Muhammad's leadership in Medina was not the invention of raiding, Arabia needed no outside party to introduce it. What changed was its systematization. Raiding became institutionally organized under a single central authority. It became religiously framed and, in some cases, directly commanded through revelation. And critically, it became subject to a formal, centrally administered revenue-sharing arrangement, examined in full later in this documentary, in which the central authority took a fixed and mandatory cut of whatever was seized. The expedition to Nakhla in January 624 is among the earliest and most instructive examples of this shift from informal tribal custom to organized, centrally directed raiding. A small party of roughly a dozen men, dispatched by Muhammad under the command of Abdullah ibn Jahsh, intercepted a small Meccan trading caravan at a location between Mecca and Taif. The raid took place during Rajab, one of the 4 traditionally sacred months across pre-Islamic Arabia, during which intertribal fighting was customarily prohibited by widespread convention. The raiding party killed 1 Meccan trader, took 2 others captive, and seized the caravan's goods, reportedly including leather and raisins. The action provoked real controversy within the early Muslim community itself, controversy serious enough to require religious address. The relevant Quranic revelation acknowledges that fighting during the sacred month is grave, while asserting that the persecution faced by Muslims at Meccan hands was graver still, a resolution that allowed the raid's proceeds to be kept and distributed rather than returned. Whatever the theological resolution, the economic content of the episode is unambiguous. An armed party, acting under central direction from Medina, intercepted a caravan and seized its goods and personnel, precisely the kind of operation Arabian tribes had long conducted against one another, now conducted under explicit centralized political command. The engagement at Badr in March 624 followed this same underlying logic at far larger scale, though the outcome diverged sharply from what was originally planned. Muhammad's forces, numbering just over 300, set out specifically to intercept a large and wealthy Meccan caravan returning from Syria under the merchant and political leader Abu Sufyan ibn Harb. This was, in its original conception, a raid of the same type as Nakhla, simply larger given the caravan's reported value. Warned of the approaching force, Abu Sufyan diverted the caravan along the coastal route and brought it safely to Mecca, denying the raiders their intended prize entirely. Meccan leadership, alarmed at the escalating threat to their commercial security, mobilized a substantial force, reportedly close to 1,000 men, to confront Muhammad's smaller force directly, rather than let the failed raid pass without consequence. The resulting battle produced a decisive and unexpected Muslim victory. The original caravan goods had escaped, but the defeated Meccan force itself yielded substantial spoils: weapons, armor, camels, equipment, along with a significant number of prisoners whose treatment through ransom is examined next in this documentary. Badr illustrates a pattern that recurs throughout the following years. Raids conceived as straightforward economic operations against caravans frequently escalated into larger engagements, each generating its own economic yield, often larger than what the original raid had targeted. Over the several years following Badr, raiding activity conducted by or on behalf of the Medinan community expanded substantially in scale and frequency, increasingly targeting settled, resource-rich communities rather than solely mobile caravans, The expulsion of the Banu Qaynuqa from Medina in 624, following a dispute that escalated into open conflict, resulted in the confiscation of their property and weapons, an economically significant action against a settled propertied community within Medina itself. The subsequent expulsion of the Banu Nadir in 625 followed a similar pattern, their fortified property and considerable accumulated wealth passing into Medinan hands, this time without formal battle. A distinction with specific implications for how these particular spoils were divided compared to conventionally conquered Ghanima, addressed later in this documentary. The defensive engagement at Uhud in 625 and the successful defence at the Battle of the Trench in 627 were followed, in the case of the latter, immediately by the campaign against the Banu Qurayza, whose defeat resulted in confiscated property and the distribution of captives, an episode this documentary returns to in detail given its significance to the captive economy specifically. Raids against the Banu Mustalik and other tribal groups through this period followed the same essential pattern. Military engagement, whatever its immediate tactical origin, generating goods, livestock, land and captives as its economic output, processed through an increasingly formalized central distribution system. The 628 campaign against the wealthy, heavily fortified Jewish settlement at Khaybar represents a further maturation of this apparatus. Khaybar was not a mobile caravan or lightly defended encampment, but a substantial fortified settlement with extensive date palm cultivation and considerable accumulated wealth. Its conquest, following a sustained siege, yielded not merely movable goods, but productive agricultural land itself, a portion of which was retained by its previous cultivators under a negotiated arrangement requiring continued work in exchange for a share of produce. This effectively converted Khaybar's ongoing agricultural output into a recurring revenue stream for Medina, distinct from the one-time windfall character of most earlier raiding. By 628, in other words, the Medinan military economic apparatus had demonstrated the capacity not merely to seize movable wealth in a single raid, but to conquer, subdue, and administer an ongoing productive asset for continued extraction over time, a capability replicated at far greater scale in the conquests of Iraq and Syria. This documentary covers later the largely negotiated, comparatively bloodless conquest of Mecca in January 630 marks the culmination of this trajectory within the peninsula itself. Rather than the seizure of goods from a single caravan, Medinan authority now extended over an entire major trading city, with its established commercial networks and central position within Arabia's broader trade and pilgrimage economy. The year of delegations that followed, through 630 and into 631, saw tribal confederations from across the peninsula, from Yemen in the south to the borders of Sassanid and Byzantine territory in the north, send envoys to negotiate submission, typically combining conversion, allegiance, and an ongoing fiscal obligation. By Muhammad's death in June 632, Ghazoo had evolved, in less than a decade, from small-scale opportunistic raiding conducted by a resource-poor migrant community into a standing, centrally directed military-economic apparatus capable of mobilizing thousands across multiple fronts, administering an extensive tribute and taxation system across the entire peninsula. This is the raiding-turned-conquest apparatus that passed upon Muhammad's death into Abu Bakr's hands. It was built for and entirely dependent on continued military success and continued expansion. Its administrative and military establishment scaled to match the revenue that expansion had generated, with no independent productive base within Medina capable of sustaining that establishment if expansion ever stalled. What this documentary turns to next is the ransom economy this raiding system generated, beginning with the captives taken at Badr, and what their treatment reveals about how systematically the Medinan community had already learned to extract value from the people its raids and battles produced. Alongside outright plunder, captives taken in raids and battles generated a second closely related revenue mechanism, ransom, known in Arabic as fida. The underlying logic was straightforward. A captive with family or tribal connections capable of paying represented a monetizable asset, exchangeable for cash, goods, or other consideration in return for release. This mechanism operated alongside and often within the very same engagements as the outright enslavement of captives this documentary examines later, with the treatment of any individual captive depending largely on whether a paying party existed and whether negotiations for release succeeded. The aftermath of the Battle of Badr in 624 provides the most extensively documented early example of this system in operation. Roughly 70 Meccan prisoners were taken following the Muslim victory, and the classical sources describe a structured ransom process applied across this captive population. Wealthier captives, or those with wealthy relatives in Mecca, had their release negotiated for substantial payments. The sources record figures varying considerably by the individual's economic and social standing, with the most prominent captives commanding the highest sums. For captives without the means to pay, alternative arrangements were made. The best-known example, frequently cited in the earliest biographical accounts, involves several literate Meccan prisoners securing release by teaching a specified number of Medinan children to read and write, in place of a cash payment their families could not provide. This is conventionally presented as evidence of Muhammad's mercy, pragmatism, and the value he placed on literacy even among defeated enemies. And it may well reflect all three at once. But considered in strictly economic terms, it also represents something worth naming directly: a flexible, value-optimizing extraction strategy applied across a mixed captive population. Where liquid capital existed through a family network, liquid capital was extracted. Where it did not, an alternative form of value, in this case a transferable skill, was extracted instead. The system was structured to ensure captives generated some realizable value for the Medinan community, regardless of their family's ability to pay in cash. Rather than releasing indigent captives with no compensating benefit at all, the ransom process itself appears, from the available accounts, to have functioned as active negotiation rather than a fixed tariff. Families or tribal representatives would approach Medina, or be approached by Medinan intermediaries, to negotiate a release price for a specific captive. The final figure, apparently reflecting the captive's perceived wealth and status, the political value of maintaining or severing ties with the captive's broader tribal network, and, in some recorded instances, the captive's own standing within Meccan society. This negotiated character matters. It shows ransom was not a passive windfall waiting to be collected, but an actively managed revenue stream requiring assessment, negotiation, and diplomatic engagement with rival communities, activity that itself demanded administrative capacity. Further evidence of how systematized the broader raiding and ransom economy had already become by the mid-620s. The ransom mechanism did not end with Badr. It continued as a recurring feature of Medinan military engagements throughout the following years, operating alongside, never as a replacement for, the parallel system of captive enslavement this documentary covers in detail shortly. A single engagement might produce some captives successfully ransomed back to paying families, and others who, lacking any paying party, were instead retained as slaves or entered into the specific legal status of concubinage. The economic function across both outcomes remained consistent. The conversion of captured human beings into monetizable or otherwise economically useful assets for the Medinan polity, whether through direct payment, alternative value extraction, or longer-term retention as labor or reproductive property. This dual-track system, ransom where a paying party existed, retention where none did, reflects a rational and evidently deliberate strategy for maximizing realizable value from every engagement's captive yield, regardless of any individual captive's family circumstances. And it is worth pausing on why this institutional consistency matters for the broader argument of this documentary. If captive treatment had been ad hoc, driven primarily by spontaneous individual clemency, we would expect considerable variation and unpredictability across different engagements. Instead, the pattern that emerges at Badr and across subsequent campaigns over the following years shows a consistent, recognizable structure. Assess the captive's family's capacity to pay. Negotiate ransom where that capacity exists. Extract alternative value or retain the captive as property where it does not. That consistency is itself meaningful evidence of an established institutional practice, rather than a series of unrelated individual decisions, a system operating according to identifiable, repeatable economic logic, administered with enough consistency across multiple engagements and multiple years to constitute a genuine institution of the emerging Medinan state. Standing alongside the formal spoils division system this documentary turns to next. Despite its clear economic significance, the ransom system carried an inherent structural limitation, one that becomes critical for understanding the crisis of 632 this documentary builds toward. Ransom revenue, like the broader spoil system it operated alongside, depended entirely on continued military engagement, generating fresh captives with paying families. It was a one-time windfall tied to specific victories and specific engagements, not a recurring, predictable revenue stream in the way zakat was designed to function, assessed annually against an ongoing base of wealth, regardless of any single military outcome. This distinction matters enormously. As the internal Arabian raiding frontier approached exhaustion in the final years of Muhammad's life, the pool of potential new captives from unsubdued tribes was itself shrinking, simply because fewer independent, unconquered groups remained to raid. Ransom, like the broader spoil system, offered diminishing returns as available targets diminished, even setting aside entirely the separate crisis in zakat compliance that erupted immediately following Muhammad's death. Considered together with the raiding system already examined, ransom illustrates a pattern essential to understanding the Riddah Wars. Virtually every major revenue mechanism available to the Medinan state, raiding, ransom, and, as this documentary turns to next, the formal division of war spoils itself, depended on the same underlying resource, a supply of new, unsubordinated targets capable of yielding fresh wealth, fresh captives, and fresh tribute. By the final years of Muhammad's life, that supply, within the confines of the Arabian Peninsula, was approaching its natural limit. This is the structural reality Abu Bakr inherited in June 632. Compounding directly with the near-simultaneous collapse in zakat compliance, this documentary examines later. Not merely a political succession crisis, but a fiscal apparatus whose every major revenue mechanism was either exhausted by geography or actively collapsing through non-compliance, at precisely the moment its founding authority figure was no longer present to manage the transition. One interpretive note belongs here, offered plainly as this documentary's own reading rather than as settled fact beyond dispute. The consistency and administrative sophistication of the ransom system, refined across multiple engagements over several years, suggests a leadership increasingly attentive to the economic optimization of warfare itself, extracting maximum realizable value from every captive, regardless of individual circumstance. Whether this reflects primarily pragmatic state-building necessity or a leadership weighing revenue considerations alongside its stated religious mission, is a question this documentary leaves open for the viewer's own judgment, rather than a conclusion the available sources can settle definitively. What follows next in this documentary is the formal system that governed how spoils from raids, ransom, and outright conquest alike were divided between the Medinan Treasury and the fighters who won them, the Khums and Ghanima framework, and its function as one of the two central pillars of Medinan state finance. As raiding scaled from opportunistic tribal practice into an organized, centrally administered activity, a formal system for dividing the resulting spoils became necessary. That system was established through Quranic revelation addressing the aftermath of Badr, commonly cited as verse 841, and it set out a clear formula. 1/5 of all war spoils, known as khums, was allocated to Muhammad and to a specified set of purposes: kin, orphans, the needy, and travellers. The remaining 4/5, Ghanima, was distributed among the fighters who had actually participated in the raid or battle that produced it. Described in plain economic terms, this is a taxation system levied on the proceeds of organized violence. Every successful raid or military engagement generated a defined mandatory revenue stream flowing to the central authority, on top of whatever individual fighters received directly for their participation. This was not incidental income to the Medinan polity. Alongside zakat, examined later in this documentary, it functioned as one of the two central pillars of state finance for the entire span of Muhammad's leadership in Medina. The significance of this formula lies in what it made possible administratively. Prior to this kind of centrally mandated division, spoils in pre-Islamic Arabian raiding custom were generally divided among the raiding party itself, according to tribal convention, with no obligatory share directed to any overarching political authority beyond the raiding group. The Khums system changed this fundamentally. It inserted a guaranteed, non-negotiable claim for the central Medinan authority into every single successful military engagement, regardless of which specific fighters or tribal contingents had done the fighting. This is, in effect, the fiscal infrastructure of a state being built directly into the mechanics of warfare itself. As the frequency, scale and success rate of Medinan campaigns increased through the second half of the 620s and into 630, comes revenue scaled directly alongside it. The conquest of the wealthy fortified settlement at Khaybar in 628 generated substantial spoils in land, goods and captives, all processed through this same Khums and Ghanima framework. The conquest of Mecca in 630, while comparatively bloodless and achieved largely through negotiation rather than battle, brought an entire major trading city and its considerable commercial wealth under Medinan political authority. And the subsequent year of delegations, through 630 and into 631, saw tribal confederations across the peninsula submit to Medinan authority, each arrangement typically incorporating some form of tribute or zakat obligation flowing back into the same treasury system. There is a crucial structural feature of the Khums and Ghanima system that deserves to be stated as plainly as possible, because it is the single most important fact for understanding everything this documentary builds toward. This system only generates revenue when there is Ghanima to distribute. It is not a tax on existing productive capacity, not a levy on land already under cultivation, or goods already being traded, assessed year after year, regardless of new events. It is a tax specifically and exclusively on the proceeds of new conquest. No new raid, no new battle, no new conquered territory means no new Khums. Full stop. This distinction is what separates Khums from zakat in terms of its underlying economic character, even though both fed the same treasury. Zakat, examined later in this documentary, was, at least in principle, a recurring tax assessed against an ongoing base of wealth, livestock, produce, trade goods, monetary holdings, payable whether or not any new military campaign had taken place that year. Khums had no such independent base. It existed only as a function of continued expansion. This means the Medinan state's finances were built, in substantial part, on an assumption of continuous forward movement, continuous new raids, continuous new territories brought under submission, continuous new spoils to divide between the treasury and the fighters who had won them. A state financed this way cannot simply pause its expansion and remain solvent in the way a state funded primarily through stable agricultural taxation could. The moment new conquest stops, this entire revenue pillar does not decline gradually. It drops to zero, immediately, because there is nothing left to tax. This documentary argues, the single most important structural fact for understanding both the Riddah Wars themselves and the conquests of Iraq and Syria that followed them almost without pause. A Khums-dependent state, confronted with the sudden loss of its central authority figure and a simultaneous collapse in tribal compliance, does not have the luxury of retrenching into a smaller, stable, self-contained territory and waiting out the crisis. Its fiscal survival requires resuming expansion as quickly as possible wherever expansion can be found, a dynamic this documentary traces directly into the immediate aftermath of the internal Arabian campaigns, when Khalid ibn al-Walid's forces moved against Sassanid territory in Iraq. Within the same year, the last major Riddah resistance was suppressed. It is worth pausing here on what this reveals about the broader character of the emerging Medinan state, beyond the specific mechanics of any single battle or campaign, a political and religious project that had begun a decade earlier as a small, vulnerable migrant community dependent on the goodwill of local hosts, had, by 630, constructed a functioning fiscal apparatus whose central government received a guaranteed, religiously mandated cut of every successful act of organized violence carried out in its name, whatever the sincerity of the religious conviction driving individual participants. And this documentary does not claim to know or attempt to adjudicate what any individual fighter privately believed. The institutional structure itself functioned, in its plain mechanics, as a state-building fiscal instrument every bit as much as a religious one. The Khums and Ghanima system, alongside the raiding and ransom mechanisms already examined, and alongside zakat and the captive and concubinage economy this documentary turns to next, together constitute the complete extraction apparatus that Abu Bakr inherited upon Muhammad's death in June 632. Every one of these mechanisms, without exception, depended either directly or substantially on continued conquest and continued tribal compliance. None of them offered an independent, self-sustaining alternative if that compliance and that conquest ever stopped simultaneously, which is precisely what happened within weeks of Muhammad's death, and which this documentary now turns to examine in full. Not all captives taken in the raids and battles this documentary has already examined were ransomed. Following major engagements, the defeat of the Banu Qurayza in 627 and the raid on the Banu Mustalik in the same general period are the most extensively documented cases in the earliest biographical sources. Women and children taken captive were distributed among the Medinan community as slaves, processed as part of the broader Ghanima allocation alongside goods and livestock, the same distribution system already examined in this documentary. Captured women entered one of two broad legal categories. Some became domestic slaves, performing household labor for the families to whom they were allotted. Others entered a specific legal status, milk al-yamin, literally what the right hand possesses. Concubinage, a status distinct from marriage under emerging Islamic legal categories, carrying its own rules regarding sexual access, an owner's obligations, and the status of any children born of the arrangement. Under the developing legal framework, such children were typically considered free and tied to the father's lineage, while the mother's own servile status generally continued unless she was later manumitted. The economic significance of this system deserves to be stated plainly rather than obscured behind euphemism. Captured women represented a conversion of conquered populations into economic capital acquired at zero purchase cost. Unlike livestock, which required ongoing feeding and maintenance without producing new economic value beyond its own body and secondary products, enslaved and captive women represented an asset class capable of generating value on an ongoing basis. Labor in the case of domestic slavery, and in the specific case of concubinage, reproductive value as well, expanding a household's free lineage while the mother's own servile status persisted indefinitely. This is not a peripheral detail in the broader Medinan economy. It stands alongside raiding, ransom, and the formal Khums and Ghanima system already examined as a primary mechanism of wealth generation available to the emerging Medinan polity. Any economic account of Medina under Muhammad that omits this system, or treats it as a minor footnote to a purely spiritual or military history, is an incomplete account. This documentary now turns to a related and more contested question, one worth examining directly and with care, rather than either avoiding it or overstating what the evidence actually shows: the institution of muta, temporary marriage, and the argument advanced by this documentary as an interpretation open to debate, not as settled historical fact, that its structure invites direct comparison to commercial sex work. Muta was a fixed-term contractual arrangement. A man and woman agreed on a specific duration and a mahr, a payment from the man to the woman, after which the arrangement dissolved automatically, with no divorce process required. It is attested in the hadith literature as practiced during parts of Muhammad's lifetime, including specifically by companions on extended military campaigns away from Medina. The expedition to Autas in the aftermath of the Battle of Hunain is among the most frequently cited instances in the sources. The stated rationale recorded in these accounts is the management of sexual need during deployment, framed as a lawful alternative to prohibited sex, rather than as a foundation for family life or long-term companionship. Structurally, muta diverged in specific and documented ways from a permanent marriage contract. There was no inheritance obligation between the parties. In the absence of specific stipulation, there was no ongoing maintenance obligation of the kind owed within permanent marriage. The union ended automatically at the specified term, with no formal dissolution process required. This documentary's interpretation, offered plainly as interpretation, and one which reasonable historians and jurists dispute, is that this minimal, term-limited, payment-based structure functioned as a licensed transactional arrangement for a mobile population, using the legal form of marriage to distinguish it from prohibited casual sex, while sharing with commercial sex work its core transactional logic. Payment exchanged for time-bound sexual access, with no expectation of permanence attached. Where this documentary will not go further is in asserting that muta and commercial sex work are simply identical, or that one is merely a disguised version of the other. The two institutions diverge in ways that matter and that a rigorous account cannot omit. Muta created a recognized legal status for any resulting child, including a claim to paternal lineage. It required, under most classical formulations, a waiting period, Riddah, following the arrangement's end, a legal mechanism tied to establishing clear paternity for any subsequent pregnancy, with no equivalent requirement attached to a commercial sexual transaction. And the mahr in a muta contract was paid directly to the individual woman party to the arrangement. It did not flow to any state treasury, religious institution or third party. There is no source establishing muta as a mechanism that generated revenue for the Medinan state in the way khums, tribute, or zakat did. Whatever else muta was, this documentary cannot responsibly present it as a state fiscal instrument alongside the mechanisms already examined, because the evidence for that specific claim does not exist. What can be stated as straightforward fact rather than interpretation? Zakat's general rule applied to lawful wealth regardless of its source. Once that wealth crossed the established threshold and was held for the specified period. Wealth accumulated through a mahr payment, like wealth accumulated through trade, wages, or livestock, would in principle have been zakat eligible under this general rule. No exemption existed for one category of lawful income over another. This is a point about zakat's general structure. not evidence of muta functioning as some distinct or specially targeted revenue category for the Medinan Treasury. This documentary raises the comparison between muta and commercial sex work because it is a real, live and unresolved argument, one made by critics within Islamic scholarship itself as well as by outside observers, and rejected by defenders of the institution who point to precisely the contractual and legal features just described. Sunni jurisprudence, notably, does not preserve muta as a live institution at all. The practice was prohibited during the caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab, a prohibition Sunni legal tradition treats as settled and binding. Twelver Shia jurisprudence, by contrast, rejects Umar's authority to forbid something it holds was permitted by Quran and Prophet alike, and muta remains a recognized, practiced institution within Shia legal contexts today. That a companion who witnessed the practice directly under Muhammad chose as caliph to prohibit it entirely is itself a fact this documentary considers significant, worth treating as evidence requiring its own explanation rather than a detail to pass over. This documentary presents the comparison, the evidence on both sides, and the fact of that later prohibition, and leaves the ultimate weighing of the argument to the viewer, not because the question is unimportant, but because it is precisely the kind of question where the honest presentation of contested evidence serves the audience better than a flat assertion. This documentary cannot fully support from the sources available. Taken together, this and the 4 accounts that preceded it, raiding, ransom, the formal division of spoils, and the captive and concubinage economy, establish the complete extraction apparatus operating in Medina by the time of Muhammad's death in June 632. Every mechanism examined depended in some fashion on continued military success, continued conquest, or continued tribal compliance. None offered an independent, self-sustaining alternative should that success and that compliance ever stop at the same time. This documentary now turns to precisely that moment, and to the war that followed it. Muhammad died in Medina in June 632, without leaving behind an unambiguous, universally accepted mechanism for political succession. Abu Bakr, one of his earliest and closest companions, was selected as caliph through a hurried negotiation at the Saqifa of the Banu Sa'idah, a process contested at the time, and for centuries afterward, most consequentially by those who held that Ali ibn Abi Talib possessed the superior claim. That succession dispute matters enormously for the later civil wars this documentary will examine in a separate account. But for the war that erupted almost immediately after Muhammad's death, the subject of this documentary, the more urgent and immediate crisis was not who would rule from Medina. It was whether anyone outside Medina would recognize any continuing obligation to keep paying into it. The extraction economy this documentary has laid out in detail, raiding, ransom, the formal division of spoils, the captive economy, and zakat, had functioned as a coherent system throughout the 620s substantially because Muhammad himself held it together. He was its military commander. He was the explicitly designated recipient of khums under Quranic revelation. He was the individual figure to whom tribes across Arabia had pledged treaties combining religious conversion with political and fiscal submission. A great many of these treaty relationships were understood, explicitly or implicitly, as personal arrangements with Muhammad specifically, not as submission to an enduring Medinan state expected to outlast him. This distinction is the centre of the entire crisis this documentary now examines. When Muhammad died, a substantial number of tribes across the peninsula did not interpret their obligations as automatically transferring to Abu Bakr, or to the Caliphate as an abstract ongoing institution. Some of these tribes had barely been subdued in the first place, submitting only in the final years of Muhammad's life, more through military pressure and negotiated advantage than through any settled internal conviction. Others maintained, directly and explicitly, according to the sources, that their obligation to pay zakat had been a personal arrangement with the Prophet himself, an arrangement discharged and closed by his death, with no successor entitled to inherit the payment. The practical effect, almost immediately following Muhammad's death, was a collapse in the flow of zakat and tribute into Medina from large parts of the peninsula. Tribal confederations across the Najd region, parts of Yemen, and the territories bordering the Persian Gulf either renounced Islam outright, renounced Medinan political authority specifically while claiming continued Muslim identity, or simply stopped sending the payments, livestock, agricultural produce, and goods that had been flowing into Medina in the final years of Muhammad's life. Recall the structural vulnerability this documentary has already laid out. Khums and Ghanima required continuous new conquest to generate any revenue at all, and by 630 to 632 the internal Arabian raiding frontier was already substantially exhausted. There were simply few remaining unsubdued tribes left to raid for fresh spoils. Zakat was the other major recurring pillar of Medinan state finance, and it is precisely this pillar that collapsed first and most severely in the weeks immediately following Muhammad's death. With Ghanima revenue already diminishing due to the exhaustion of available targets, and zakat now failing due to widespread political fragmentation, the Medinan Treasury faced the near-simultaneous failure of both of its primary income mechanisms within a matter of weeks. This is the concrete fiscal reality Abu Bakr confronted upon taking office. Not primarily a crisis of theology, though it was certainly framed and prosecuted in theological language, as this documentary examines next, but a state whose entire administrative, military, and redistributive apparatus had been built and scaled around continuous revenue from conquest and tribute, now facing the collapse of both major income streams at precisely the moment its founding authority figure, the one whose personal prestige and religious legitimacy had substituted for any deeper institutional durability, was no longer present to hold the arrangement together. It is worth stating directly what this meant in practical terms for the Medinan state as an institution, separate from any question of individual belief or conviction among the tribes now withholding payment. An administrative and military apparatus had been built up over the preceding several years specifically to manage, direct, and profit from continuous campaigning across an expanding territory. That apparatus required ongoing resources to sustain itself. Arms, mounts, provisions, and the expectation among tribal levies that continued participation in the Medinan military project would continue to be economically worthwhile. A state facing simultaneous zakat collapse and Ghanima exhaustion, with an already scaled military establishment still in place and still requiring resources to maintain, faced not a gradual, manageable fiscal decline, but an acute and immediate emergency. This documentary's argument examined across the remaining accounts in this section, is that Abu Bakr's government responded to this emergency not primarily as a court adjudicating religious deviation, but as a state fighting for its fiscal survival. And that understanding this response requires setting aside, at least provisionally, the conventional framing of these events as a purely theological conflict between true believers and apostates. What follows next in this documentary examines exactly how that response was structured, specifically why Abu Bakr's government treated the refusal to pay zakat and the wholesale renunciation of Islamic belief as functionally identical offences, deserving of the identical military response. Historically and theologically, apostasy, Riddah, and the refusal to pay zakat are distinct categories. The first concerns religious belief and identity, renouncing Islam entirely, often accompanied by allegiance to a rival prophetic claimant, examined directly in the account that follows this one. The second concerns a specific financial obligation, one which a person could in principle refuse while still affirming Muslim belief and practice in every other respect, continuing to pray, continuing to fast, continuing to identify fully as a member of the Muslim community, while simply declining to hand over the specified share of livestock, produce, or goods. What the historical record shows, however, is that Abu Bakr's government did not meaningfully distinguish between these two categories in its actual military response. Tribes that had wholly apostatized, tribes that had pledged allegiance to a rival prophet, and tribes that had simply stopped paying zakat while continuing to pray and identify as Muslim were all treated in practice as legitimate military targets under the same campaign. Al-Tabari's historical compilation, the principal narrative source for this period, groups these categories together under the single rubric of Riddah, without drawing any sharp operational distinction between them in describing how Abu Bakr's forces actually engaged each one. This pattern deserves close attention because it is the single strongest piece of evidence this documentary offers for reading the Riddah Wars as fundamentally a fiscal compliance crisis, prosecuted under the available religious legal vocabulary of apostasy, rather than a war principally concerned with belief. If the crisis had been purely theological, communities genuinely renouncing belief in Islam itself, we would expect the sources to record a markedly different kind of response toward tribes that maintained full Muslim identity, but simply withheld a tax payment, perhaps debate, religious argument, an attempt at doctrinal reconciliation, some effort to distinguish a fiscal dispute from a crisis of faith. Instead, the recorded response was uniform and military. Armed campaigns were dispatched against any group that stopped contributing to Medina's revenue, largely regardless of whether that particular group had actually renounced the faith or had merely renounced the specific fiscal obligation attached to it. Apostasy, in other words, functioned in practice as the available legal category through which non-payment could be treated as treason against the emerging state. This was a framework the fledgling Medinan political and legal order had ready at hand, since the alternative, something closer to a purely secular tax enforcement action, had no comparable precedent or legitimating structure available to a polity whose entire claim to authority was, from its foundation, religious in nature. A state that derives its legitimacy from prophetic revelation does not have an equivalent secular vocabulary available for treating a tax dispute as a tax dispute. It has, instead, the vocabulary of belief and betrayal. And that is the vocabulary Abu Bakr's government reached for and applied uniformly. Abu Bakr's own recorded words on the matter, preserved across multiple hadith collections, including Sahih Bukhari, are direct and worth stating plainly. He declared that he would fight anyone who withheld from him even the smallest fraction of what they had paid to the Messenger of God. In some versions of the account, specified as a hobbling rope used to tether a camel. In other versions, as a young female goat. Read purely as a statement of religious conviction, this expresses an uncompromising commitment to continuing the Prophet's practice in full, without exception or erosion. Read as a statement of fiscal policy, it is the language of a treasurer determined to prevent any reduction in revenue whatsoever, treating even the most minor withholding as a threat serious enough to warrant a full military response. This documentary does not claim these two readings are mutually exclusive. Both can be true of the same statement at once, but the practical, enforced content of the resulting policy was revenue collection, backed by force, applied with total uniformity, regardless of whether the withholding tribe still considered itself part of the Muslim community. The sources also preserve an account of Umar ibn al-Khattab initially urging leniency toward tribes that continued to pray and profess Islam, while refusing zakat specifically, questioning whether war against nominally believing communities over a financial obligation was truly justified. Abu Bakr's reported response that he would fight anyone who attempted to separate prayer from zakat, since the Prophet had joined the two together as a single, indivisible obligation, settled the internal debate and set the uncompromising policy firmly in motion. This internal disagreement, preserved even within sources generally favourable to Abu Bakr's memory, is itself meaningful evidence that the fiscal dimension of the crisis was recognised and actively debated at the time as at least partially distinct from pure apostasy, before ultimately being folded into a single uniform military response covering both categories without further distinction. It is worth pausing on what this internal debate reveals. Umar was not a marginal or peripheral figure raising an idle objection. He was among Muhammad's closest companions and would himself become the second caliph. His hesitation suggests that the identification of non-payment with apostasy was not an obvious, uncontested application of settled doctrine, but a specific policy decision, actively contested within the highest levels of the new Medinan leadership, and resolved decisively in the direction of uniform military enforcement, rather than any attempt to separate fiscal non-compliance from genuine religious deviation. This documentary's interpretation of this evidence, offered plainly as interpretation, open for the viewer's own weighing rather than asserted as an uncontested conclusion, is that Abu Bakr's government, faced with the simultaneous fiscal emergency examined in the previous account, made a deliberate decision to treat any reduction in revenue as an existential threat requiring the harshest available response, and that the vocabulary of apostasy was the most readily available tool for justifying that response to a religiously legitimated state's own following. Whether Abu Bakr himself experienced this as cynical fiscal enforcement dressed in religious language, or as a sincere fusion of religious conviction and practical necessity that did not feel like a distinction to him at all, is not a question this documentary can answer from the available sources, and it does not claim to. What can be stated with confidence, based on the uniform pattern of military response documented across the sources, is this: whatever individual conviction motivated Abu Bakr and his commanders, the policy that resulted treated fiscal compliance and religious orthodoxy as a single, indivisible test, enforced by the same armies against the same range of targets, without meaningful distinction between the tribe that had genuinely apostatized and the tribe that had merely stopped paying. That policy, and the campaigns it produced, is what this documentary turns to next, beginning with Musaylimah, the rival prophetic claimant whose territory at Yamama was also, not incidentally, among the wealthiest prizes remaining anywhere on the Arabian Peninsula. Musaylimah ibn Habib, leader of the Banu Hanifa in the Yamama region of Central Arabia, is conventionally remembered in Islamic historiography primarily as a rival prophet, a false claimant whose movement represented a direct theological challenge to Muhammad's message, derisively remembered in later tradition through the diminutive al-Kadhdhab, the liar. This framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that matters directly for the economic argument this documentary has built across the preceding accounts. Yamama was not a marginal desert encampment housing a handful of deluded followers. It was among the most fertile and agriculturally productive regions of Central Arabia, with a settled population, established agricultural infrastructure, and correspondingly substantial accumulated wealth, relative to the more sparsely resourced nomadic tribal territories found elsewhere on the peninsula. Musaylimah's movement combined a rival prophetic claim with control over one of the wealthiest remaining independent territories anywhere in Arabia, precisely the kind of prize a fiscally desperate Medinan state, in the condition this documentary has already described, most urgently needed to reabsorb. The campaign against Musaylimah, led by Khalid ibn al-Walid, culminated in the Battle of Yamama in 633, also remembered in the sources as the Battle of the Garden of Death, a reference to the walled orchard where much of the fighting concentrated. Traditional accounts describe this as among the costliest engagements of the entire Riddah campaign, with Muslim losses reported in the hundreds to well over 1,000, including a significant number of men who had memorized the Quran in full. This particular casualty detail is cited in later tradition as part of the impetus for compiling the Quran into a single authoritative written text, since the death of so many who carried it in memory raised genuine concern about the preservation of the text itself, a concern that would shape Islamic scholarship for generations afterward. The scale of resistance and the severity of losses at Yamama are themselves suggestive of something this documentary wants to draw out directly. This was not a lopsided suppression of a minor, isolated cult easily brushed aside by a superior military force. It was a hard-fought campaign against a well-organized, well-resourced, and well-defended settled population, determined to preserve both its independence and its considerable accumulated wealth. That the campaign proved worth such heavy losses to Khalid's forces reflects, at least in part, the scale of the economic prize genuinely at stake in reabsorbing Yamama's agricultural wealth back into the Medinan system, a stake this documentary argues was at least as significant a driver of the campaign's intensity as the theological threat Musaylimah's prophetic claim represented on its own. Khalid's broader campaign sequence across the Riddah Wars is similarly instructive when examined as a whole rather than engagement by engagement. Before Yamama, Khalid's forces moved against Tulayha ibn Khuwaylid, leader of the Banu Asad and a rival prophetic claimant in his own right, whose coalition, incorporating elements of the Ghatafan and other confederated tribes, represented another substantial concentration of tribal power and resources in central northern Arabia. The campaign against Tulayha's coalition at the Battle of Buzakha, followed shortly afterward by the move against Yamama, reflects a targeting priority directed toward the largest, wealthiest, and most militarily consequential concentrations of resistant power first. Precisely the pattern this documentary would expect from a campaign primarily oriented toward restoring the maximum possible revenue base in the shortest possible time, rather than one oriented instead toward addressing the most severe theological deviations first, regardless of their underlying material significance. It is worth considering, briefly, what an alternative sequencing might have looked like if the driving priority had been theological severity rather than economic weight. A purely theology-first campaign might have prioritized targets according to the perceived gravity of their doctrinal deviation, perhaps addressing scattered tribes that had simply reverted to pre-Islamic practice before confronting the more organized, better defended, rival prophetic movements, on the theory that outright unbelief represented a more fundamental rupture than a rival claim to prophecy, still operating within a broadly monotheistic framework. Instead, the campaigns moved directly and early against the two largest, wealthiest, most heavily defended concentrations of resistant power on the entire peninsula, Tulayha's coalition and then Musaylimah's Yamama, a sequencing far more consistent with a campaign designed to neutralize the greatest threats to renewed revenue flow as quickly as possible. This documentary's reading of this pattern, again offered as interpretation rather than as an uncontested conclusion, the sources themselves explicitly state, is that Abu Bakr's government prioritized targets according to their economic and strategic weight, the wealthiest agricultural territories, the most substantial tribal confederations, and the regions most capable of either supplying or permanently withholding significant revenue from Medina going forward. This is not to say that religious conviction played no role in how participants on either side of these conflicts understood what they were fighting for and against. Fighters on the Medinan side may well have understood themselves to be defending the integrity of the faith against a dangerous rival prophetic claim. Fighters on Musaylimah's side may well have genuinely believed in his prophetic claims. This documentary does not claim access to those private convictions and does not attempt to adjudicate them. What this documentary does argue, based on the material record examined here, is that the pattern of who was targeted, in what order and at what cost, is difficult to explain convincingly on purely theological grounds alone. A war fought purely to correct religious deviation, with no attention whatsoever to the material stakes involved, offers no obvious reason why the two wealthiest, most heavily fortified resistant territories on the peninsula would be prioritized ahead of more scattered, less consequential apostate groups elsewhere. a war fought to restore a collapsing fiscal system, prosecuted under the available vocabulary of apostasy, offers a straightforward and economically coherent explanation for exactly that sequencing. There is a further detail worth drawing out from the Yamama campaign specifically, because it illustrates something important about how thoroughly economic and religious considerations were intertwined in the conduct of this war, rather than existing as cleanly separable motives. Following the defeat of Musaylimah and the Banu Hanifa, the tribe's submission to Medinan authority reincorporated Yamama's agricultural wealth directly into the same tribute and zakat system this documentary examined in its earlier accounts, meaning the campaign's ultimate outcome was not merely the elimination of a rival religious claimant, but the concrete restoration of a substantial revenue stream to the Medinan Treasury, achieved at the cost of some of the heaviest casualties suffered anywhere during the entire Riddah campaign. Taken together, the Musaylimah campaign specifically, and the broader sequencing of Khalid's campaigns generally, support this documentary's central reading, that Abu Bakr's government, faced with the fiscal emergency examined earlier in this account, directed its military response according to a logic that tracked economic and strategic weight closely, even as it was formally prosecuted and justified through the religious legal vocabulary of apostasy. Whatever the sincere religious convictions held by individual participants on either side, the pattern of targeting, sequencing, and cost is, this documentary argues, more consistent with a campaign oriented toward fiscal reabsorption than with one oriented purely toward theological correction. What this documentary turns to next is the consequence of this campaign's success, a consequence that receives far less attention in conventional accounts of the Riddah Wars than the battles themselves. Once Musaylimah was defeated, Tulayha's coalition dispersed, and the peninsula's remaining resistant tribes brought back into compliance. The Medinan state confronted an entirely new problem it had, in effect, created for itself. There were no longer any significant, unsubdued targets left anywhere within Arabia. The internal frontier that had sustained a decade of raiding, ransom, and conquest-driven revenue was, for all practical purposes, closed, and a fiscal system built entirely around continuous expansion now had nowhere left inside the peninsula to expand. By the end of 633, Abu Bakr's campaigns had substantially suppressed organized resistance across the Arabian Peninsula. Musaylimah was dead. Tulayha's coalition was defeated, and its leader would later reconcile with Medinan authority. The various zakat-refusing tribes had been brought back into compliance, whether through negotiated submission or outright military defeat. In the conventional telling of this history, this is where the story of the Riddah Wars ends, a successful defense of Islamic unity against apostasy and rebellion, concluded within roughly a year of Muhammad's death. But viewed purely through the economic lens this documentary has built across the preceding accounts, this victory created an immediate and severe new problem, one rarely given the attention it deserves in conventional narratives of this period. The internal Arabian frontier was now, for all practical purposes, closed. Every tribe capable of being raided, taxed, or absorbed into the tribute system had already been raided, taxed, or absorbed. there were no new internal targets remaining anywhere on the peninsula capable of generating the kind of Ghanima and Khums windfalls that had fueled the Medinan economy for the previous decade. Zakat compliance had been restored across the peninsula, but zakat alone, a modest and regular tax on existing wealth, could not replace the scale of revenue that continuous conquest had previously supplied, nor could it fund the ongoing military establishment that had just been built up and mobilized specifically to fight the Riddah campaigns themselves. Recall the structural argument this documentary laid out earlier regarding the Khums and Ghanima system. It is not a tax on existing productive capacity, assessed year after year regardless of new events, but a tax specifically on the proceeds of new conquest. A large, recently mobilized military establishment accustomed to campaign-based compensation and reasonably expecting continued opportunities for spoils given the pattern of the preceding decade, does not simply demobilize gracefully the moment internal targets run out. The tribal levies that had provided the manpower for the Riddah campaigns had done so in no small part, because participation in successful campaigns was itself economically rewarding. A soldier who fought at Yamama or Busaka expected reasonably some share of what was won there. A sudden and total halt to campaigning with no replacement source of spoils on the horizon risked reigniting precisely the kind of fragmentation and non-compliance that had just been suppressed at very considerable cost. It is in this specific context, a newly reunified but fiscally exhausted state, sitting atop a demobilizing but still expectant military apparatus, with no remaining internal frontier left to exploit, that the near-immediate redirection of Khalid ibn al-Walid's forces toward Sassanid-held Iraq, beginning already in 633, becomes explicable as something other than a delayed, separately motivated religious project undertaken only once the internal crisis had fully settled. The same commander, leading substantially the same tribal levies who had just fought the internal Riddah campaigns to their conclusion, moved directly into raiding and then systematic campaigning against Sassanid frontier territory, almost immediately upon Arabia's internal pacification, with barely any interval separating the two undertakings. The campaign into Byzantine Syria followed shortly afterward, in 634, under a closely similar logic, and drawing on many of the same tribal confederations now formally bound into the Medinan military fiscal system through the settlements that had ended the Riddah Wars. This continuity deserves to be stated plainly because it is one of the strongest pieces of internal evidence this documentary can offer for its central argument. Consider the alternative version of this history that conventional narratives generally imply, a bitter internal civil war over apostasy and false prophecy, concluded through hard fighting and eventual reconciliation, followed after some meaningful interval of consolidation, religious reflection, and internal stabilization, by a quite separate and independently motivated wave of religious conquest directed outward against neighboring empires. That is not, in fact, the sequence the sources describe. What the sources describe instead is a continuous, essentially uninterrupted military project, employing the same commanders and the same tribal manpower, in which the internal frontier closes and the external frontier opens within the same calendar year, with no meaningful pause for consolidation in between. This documentary's interpretation of that continuity, again, offered as an argued reading of the evidence rather than as an uncontested fact, is that the transition from the Riddah Wars into the conquests of Iraq and Syria was not two separate historical episodes, joined only by chronological proximity and a shared religious framework, but a single continuous fiscal military project. The internal campaigns restored compliance and reabsorbed what wealth remained available within Arabia itself. The moment that internal wealth was exhausted, which happened essentially simultaneously with the internal campaign's military conclusion, the same apparatus, requiring the same kind of continuous input to remain solvent, redirected itself outward toward the only remaining sources of comparable wealth, the settled, wealthy, agriculturally rich frontier territories of two declining but still substantial empires. There is a further piece of context worth drawing out here, one this documentary has not yet addressed directly, but which strengthens the case considerably. Both the Sassanid and Byzantine empires had, by the early 630s, been substantially weakened by decades of mutual warfare against one another, a prolonged conflict that had left both empires' frontier provinces underdefended, their populations exhausted, and their administrative control over border regions considerably attenuated compared to earlier decades. This is not, this documentary argues, incidental to the timing of the Arab campaigns that followed the Riddah Wars. A fiscally desperate Medinan state, having just exhausted its internal Arabian frontier, found itself geographically adjacent to precisely the kind of weakened, wealthy, comparatively vulnerable territory that its extraction-dependent economic model most urgently required, and it moved toward that territory with remarkable speed, using an army that had, in effect, no other direction left to go if it wished to remain economically viable. None of this is to suggest that the conquests of Iraq and Syria lacked any religious dimension whatsoever, or that participants in these campaigns experienced them purely as an economic enterprise stripped of any spiritual significance. This documentary does not claim access to those individual convictions, any more than it claimed such access in examining the Riddah campaigns themselves. What this documentary does argue, based on the timing, the personnel continuity, and the underlying fiscal logic already established across the preceding accounts, is that the material causation driving the timing, direction, and urgency of these campaigns is best explained by the structural fiscal collapse this documentary has traced from Muhammad's death onward, not as a separate chapter in a purely religious history, but as the direct and nearly immediate continuation of the same crisis that produced the Riddah Wars themselves. The account that follows this one turns to evidence beyond the internal Muslim historical tradition. The testimony of contemporary and near-contemporary non-Muslim observers, writing from within the very territories these campaigns targeted, whose descriptions of the conquests as they unfolded offer an outside check on the economic reading this documentary has built from the internal sources alone. Everything this documentary has argued so far rests substantially on sources internal to the Islamic historical tradition itself, the Sirah literature, the Hadith collections, and later historical compilations such as Al-Tabari's. These sources, as this documentary noted at the outset, were compiled generations after the events they describe, within scholarly and political environments shaped by later concerns. It is worth asking, then, whether anything outside that tradition corroborates the economic reading this documentary has built. Testimony from observers who had no stake in later debates over Rashidun legitimacy, writing closer to the events themselves, or, in some cases, writing as the events were still unfolding. Several such sources exist, and they matter precisely because of their independence from the internal tradition. Cebeos, an Armenian bishop writing in the 600s, within a single generation of the events in question, describes the Arab conquests that followed the Riddah Wars in terms that are strikingly material rather than theological. His account frames the initial unification of the Arabian tribes partly around claims of Ishmaelite ancestry and inheritance, a form of religious legitimation. But what is notable is how quickly and thoroughly his narrative moves past this framing once the conquests themselves begin. Cebeos is not writing a story primarily concerned with competing revelations or theological disputes between rival prophetic claims. He is writing about an army that arrives, defeats Byzantine and Sassanid forces in the field, and imposes systematic tribute and taxation obligations on the populations it conquers. The religious self-justification appears in his account largely as a framing device layered over what he treats, in the great bulk of his narrative, as a straightforward campaign of conquest, taxation, and resource acquisition. The Doctrina Jacobi, a Greek text composed between roughly 634 and 640, meaning it was written essentially contemporaneously with the events this documentary has been describing, offers a different kind of evidence. It takes the form of a polemical dialogue, and it carries its own clear biases and distortions. This documentary does not present it as a neutral or disinterested account, but its value lies precisely in its immediacy. It is, in effect, a document written by people experiencing these events directly, in something close to real time, rather than reconstructing them from later memory. It describes the invading forces as killing and pillaging, and it explicitly connects the prophetic figure at the center of the new movement, not with a body of spiritual teaching, but with promises of paradise tied directly to material conquest. Whatever its polemical distortions, this text corroborates something this documentary considers significant. Outside observers, encountering these events as they happened, experienced them primarily as violent economic disruption, plunder and conquest, rather than as a wave of religious evangelism arriving through preaching and persuasion. A further body of evidence comes from Syriac chronicles composed in the same general period, including the brief notice attributed to Thomas the Presbyter, recording the Battle of Gaza in 634. This account is terse and administrative in character. It records troop movements, a battle, and its casualties and plunder, with no attention whatsoever to theological content, no mention of preaching or conversion, no interest in the religious claims of either side. It reads in essence as a military notice. An army arrived, fought, and took spoils. That this is how a contemporary chronicler, writing from within the very region being conquered, chose to record the event is itself telling. Had these campaigns been experienced primarily as a religious movement expanding through conversion and persuasion, we might expect at least some acknowledgement of that dimension in a chronicle composed by someone living through it. Instead, what survives reads as a record of military economic activity, described in exactly the terms one would use to describe any other conquering army of the period. Beyond narrative sources, the administrative and material record adds a further different kind of corroboration. Papyri surviving from early conquest-era Egypt, the Nisana and Aphrodito collections, somewhat later than the initial conquests but reflecting continuity of established administrative practice, show the new Arab administration largely preserving existing Byzantine tax collection infrastructure, rather than replacing it with anything distinctly new or specifically Islamic in character. This is a significant data point for the argument this documentary has built. It indicates that the priority of the conquering administration in the years immediately following conquest was maintaining the flow of tax revenue through whatever machinery was already in place and already functioning, rather than constructing an entirely new religious administrative apparatus from first principles. Continuity of extraction, in other words, mattered more in practice than doctrinal transformation, at least in the immediate years following conquest, when the practical business of governing newly acquired revenue-generating territory took evident precedence. Taken together, these sources, an Armenian bishop writing a generation later, a Greek polemicist writing essentially in real time, a Syriac chronicler recording events with the flat affect of a military report, and the administrative papyri showing continuity of tax machinery over religious rupture, converge on a picture consistent with everything this documentary has argued from the internal Muslim sources alone. Internal accounts, read critically and stripped of later theological framing, show a treasury crisis triggering the Riddah campaigns. External, independent, contemporary sources describe the resulting conquests in terms of tribute, plunder, and administrative continuity, with religious language functioning as a legitimizing frame rather than as the primary observed content of the conquests themselves. And the material record of tax administration shows revenue continuity prioritized over doctrinal transformation in the conquered territories' actual day-to-day governance. This convergence across genuinely independent bodies of evidence, internal narrative, external narrative, and administrative record, is, this documentary argues, about as strong a triangulated historical case as this kind of question typically allows. It is not proof beyond any possible dispute. History of this period rarely permits that degree of certainty, given the fragmentary and often compromised character of every surviving source. But it is a case built from multiple independent angles, converging on the same conclusion, which is a considerably stronger evidentiary position than relying on any single source tradition alone, particularly one like the internal Islamic historical record that this documentary has already flagged as shaped by later sectarian and political concerns. It is worth stating clearly, as this documentary closes this particular line of evidence, exactly what this convergence does and does not establish. It establishes, with reasonable confidence, that the material record, internal and external alike, supports reading the Riddah Wars and the conquests that followed as substantially driven by fiscal collapse and the structural demands of a conquest-dependent economic system, with religious framing serving a legitimizing function rather than standing as the primary observed motive in either the internal or external record. It does not establish and cannot establish what any individual participant in these events subjectively believed or intended. A soldier fighting at Yamama, a commander directing the campaign into Syria, or Abu Bakr himself issuing the policy that identified non-payment with apostasy, may have held entirely sincere religious convictions about the righteousness of what they were doing, even as the material pattern of their actions tracked economic logic with remarkable consistency. This documentary has been careful throughout not to claim access to those private convictions, because no source, internal or external then or now, actually grants that access. The claim this documentary makes, and which this account of external corroboration is intended to strengthen rather than to overstate, is the narrower and more defensible one stated at several points across this account, that the Riddah Wars functioned as the first major fiscal crisis of a state whose entire economic model depended on continuous conquest, that the available religious legal vocabulary of apostasy provided the framework through which that crisis was prosecuted as rebellion, and that the resulting conquests of Iraq and Syria represent the direct, nearly immediate continuation of that same fiscal logic, rather than a separately motivated religious project undertaken only after some interval of internal consolidation. Whatever the sincere convictions of any individual participant, the material record, internal and external alike, is, this documentary argues, more consistent with that reading than with the conventional account of a purely theological war followed, after due reflection, by a purely theological conquest. This is where this documentary's account of the Riddah Wars themselves concludes. What began as a fragile migrant community's search for basic economic survival in a resource-poor oasis settlement had become, within little more than a decade, an extraction economy sophisticated enough to fund an army, sustain an expanding state, and, once its founding authority figure was gone and its internal revenue collapsed, absorb an entire peninsula's remaining wealth through a war fought in the name of faith, before turning, almost without pause, toward the wealth of two neighbouring empires, already weakened and waiting beyond Arabia's borders. Black Page Research, rewriting what was written in chains.